Okay, hello everyone, good evening. Since we have 4 guest speakers today, it is worth starting with a few introductions. So my name is Rami Zidan, and I am an associate professor at the University of Kansas, but I'm here as a visiting professor at UC Berkeley and the professor of this course. The topic of this course is Israeli politics and society, historical and contemporary status of Israel's minorities. In the audience, we have 23 students in this course who are coming from UC Berkeley, Stanford, and Menlo College. In addition, we have also a few staff members from Yahel, Israel. This course is part of the Summer Global Internship in Haifa, Israel, which is a partnership between the Helen Diller Institute of Jewish Law and Israel Studies at UC Berkeley and UC Berkeley Study Abroad program and Yahel, Israel. We are running this program for the second year. This is a complex and intense program for 2 months, which as a whole focuses on social change. Its components include the following. One course, which as I already mentioned, on Israeli history, politics, and society, with a deeper examination into the history and status of minorities. The second part is a second course that focuses on history through excursions to places such as Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and Haifa, which broadens the learning outside the classroom while meeting some members of the communities we learn about. The third component of this program is the internship work within Haifa's diverse communities, which every student is invested in for a few days per week for 8 weeks. The internships build on Yahel's focus on social change in Haifa's marginalized communities and reinforces the program's goals. Coupled with the academic courses focusing on examining the status of minorities within Israel, this is expected to provide a more profound understanding of the complexities of the Israeli society. Just lately, as Dr. Rebecca Goldberg from UC Berkeley said, what students learn in their internships becomes relevant to the content of the course and vice versa. The fourth component of this program is that most students also take our optional offering of the learning the Hebrew language, which further contributes to cultural immersion and facilitates competency in internships and social connections. Finally, living in Haifa is a major tool of immersion in the city itself with its communities, and the Yahel programming focuses on the social cohesion of the group and helps in connecting and reinforcing all aspects of this program. All of these are components of our program in global internship, and we are very much proud of that. On this basis, our team has decided to hold this event in bringing together experts in the field to discuss the most important development in Israeli society these days. Just yesterday, the Knesset passed the first major piece of legislation for the planned judicial reform. Protesters took to the streets, with those opposing versus those supporting the legislation. This is a critical time, an unprecedented development in Israel's history. It can potentially influence Israel's future on multiple levels, including politically, socially, economically, and as I said earlier to my students, it could even affect the relations with the United States. We want to discuss the judicial reforms and their potential impact on social change and communities in Israeli society. For this reason, we have with us 4 prominent scholars who will help us understand the judicial reform and how it might affect Israeli society and some of the social groups we have been discussing in the classroom and in the program in general. I will briefly introduce our guest speakers. Dr. Masua Sagiv is the Koret Visiting Assistant Professor of Jewish and Israel Studies at UC Berkeley and a scholar in residence of the Shalom Hartman Institute based in the San Francisco Bay Area. Dr. Sagiv will delve into law and social change and the reform's effect on matters of religion and state. Dr. Manal Totry-Jubran is an associate professor at the law faculty at Bar-Ilan University. Dr. Jubran will delve into the judicial system's effect on Arab-Palestinian society in Israel and the potential impact on the reforms on them. Professor Ruth Halperin is the founding director of the Rahman Center for the Advancement of Status of Women at Bar-Ilan University Law School, where she serves as associate professor. Dr. Halperin will explore the judicial system's role regarding women in Israel and the potential impact of the reforms on this topic. Dr. Roy Pellet is an associate professor at the Chaim Strix School of Law at the College of Management Academic Studies. Dr. Pellet was a visiting faculty at UC Berkeley before. Dr. Pellet will explore the implications of the reforms on the civil service and on judicial appointments. Please join me in welcoming our guest speakers. Each of our guest speakers will get up to 15 minutes to present their topic. After that, we will hold a discussion with questions from the audience, from our students. And first will be Dr. Masua Sagiv, please.
Okay. Hi, everyone. When we last met, it was so much less hot. I just need, oh, great. Thank you so much. Okay. So what I'm going to do in this segment is offer 4 comments or observations around social change and religion and state and the reforms or the legislation or the legal coup, whichever term you want to use. The first remark I want to make is about religion and state in Israel. What you see here is an interview that was conducted around 2 years ago with Avi Maoz, who is today a member of the Knesset, part of the government. And what he says in this interview, and this is the title, and he's very proud in this title, is, "We are a Jewish state. You can drop the democratic." This is not just wishful thinking. This is what he's actively trying to promote, dropping the democratic and staying with the Jewish. And even those members of the government who are saying, no, we are still a democracy, we should still be a democracy, the relationship between the 2 components of the definition of the state, Judaism and democracy, are very different than those of the liberal side of Israel, if you will. You already know that Israel is defined as a Jewish and democratic state. I'm sure that you talk about it every other week or so. But when Israel says that it's a Jewish and democratic state, what it really means that as a Jewish state, it's a Jewish Orthodox state. And as a Jewish Orthodox state, orthodoxy is a recognized religion. And the most extreme interpretation of orthodoxy is the one who is recognized in Israel's laws and in Israel's even customs and regulations. Now, what the suggested legal reform is going to provide or allow is the entrenchment of this extreme version of Judaism, of Orthodox Judaism, to more and more fields. Now, this specific government is the most religious, most extreme religious Orthodox government Israel ever had, with a very large number of religious and ultra-religious, ultra-nationalists, ministers and members of the Knesset and the government. And that means, and as you know, because I'm sure that you've talked about the end goal of the legal reform is to give more power to the government and less power to balance and to supervise to the judiciary. Okay, basically all the package of the legal changes that are promoted, the end goal is to give more power to the government, less balancing power, less supervision to the court. Now, what can you do with this amount of power? You can give more budgets to sectors in society, to specific sectors in society, specifically to ultra-Orthodox education without core curriculum, specifically more budgets to settlements, religious settlements, Orthodox settlements over other places around Israel. You can influence appointments. So that they don't have to be, or they can be less professional and more political. So you can get more people into influence positions, even though they might be part of a smaller segment of the Israeli society. You can strengthen certain institutions and weaken other institutions. So for example, you can further strengthen the rabbinical courts and the rabbinate in Israel, and I'm sure that Professor Halperin Kedarri will talk about that soon, but you can, and there are specific in everything that I'm saying, I'm not just saying as examples that I have thought about. These are examples that are currently in effect or being promoted by this current government. So strengthening the rabbinate, strengthening the rabbinical courts, influencing the appointments of the people in these institutions, and of course, influencing the appointments of judges who will then adjudicate cases concerning religion and state. And as a result, also weakening the power of liberal Judaism and institutions of liberal Judaism, organizations that are working towards liberal Jewish education, liberal Jewish rabbis, etc. That's the first remark. Second remark is, okay. Second remark, now all of these, from here on, the pictures are, most of them are pictures when I walked in the different protests during my visit here in Israel. These are just photos that I took of signs in the protests. This is the how do you say Chozeh Medina? How would you call it? Like the visionary of the state, Binyamin Ze'ev Herzl, the founder of the Zionist movement, shedding tears about what happened to the Zionist movement today. There's also a nice version of him throwing up, but I spared you. This is a tension between groups in society. There are the main groups in Israeli society, according to the famous speech by former President of Israel, Reuven Rivlin. You have the secular Israelis, you have the religious Zionists, you have the ultra-Orthodox, and you have the Arab-Palestinians. For the most part in the life of Israel, whoever held the wheel of the state were the secular liberals. Now, the number of the secular liberals is decreasing in Israel. And I think, and you can disagree with me, but this is a moment of decision for Israeli secular liberal Jews asking themselves, what is our role in future Israel? In future Israel, are we still going to be in charge of developing how this state is going to look like? Or right now, we should play the same game as the other groups in Israel? We should actually start being a minority. And if we're a minority, then maybe we need to demand rights. And we are not in charge of all of Israel right now. We don't care about Israel as a state anymore. We care. We don't really care. We're not the adult anymore. We're going to take care of ourselves and ourselves only. And this is a turning point for Israeli society in this sense. Third remark has to do with how changes are conducted. If you don't know, this is the symbol of the state of Israel, the menorah, the olive leaves, and then this is a sign of Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's the police chief and a proud racist and Jewish supremacist. You see what he's doing to the symbol of the state. How changes are conducted. As you know, Israel doesn't have a formal constitution. As part of not having a formal constitution, it doesn't have a constitutional procedure for everything so that we'll know which issues are constitutional, and therefore they need to go through a constitutional procedure. For example, a special majority. For example, a certain amount of time that you have to spend in a public discourse in order to conduct this change. We don't have this. So now we have like two sides inside Israel, right? So one side, the protesters, are saying, this is what the package of legislation that you're suggesting is something that is going to change the constitutional structure of the state of Israel. That's not a usual majority. You cannot just decide, like you vote on every other law, on changing this, on passing this package of laws. You can't do that. And then you have another side in Israeli society that says, it's just another law. What are you so concerned about? It's just another law. We are the majority. The only problem that you have is that you lost the election. You lost the election. Now we're the majority, so shut up. This is a remarkable picture from this morning. These are this morning's newspapers in Israel. Did you see it? Okay. Now, it's not the newspapers themselves that put on this photo. It's actually ads. So the protesters bought the opening, the front page, the cover, front page ad, and put this here with the writing, it's a black day for Israeli democracy. This is not just the content of the legislation that passed yesterday, but it's a lot about procedure. How do constitutional legislations should pass? What's the right procedure for constitutional arrangements? Is it broad agreement among all the groups of society, or is it just a political majority? And fourth and last remark is, what should the protesters do? You're in a fellowship of social change. How do you promote social change in society? When you come across a package of laws that you think that is actually going to be the end of Israeli democracy, what are you doing? Are you going and striving for a compromise? Or are you saying no compromise? We're going all the way. We will, if we need to, we say that we don't volunteer to the military, to the reserve anymore. We're not going to stay in the army, in the military, if this is a situation. We're going to stop. We're going to stop everything. We're going to pause the job market. We're going to be in the street every week, and then twice a week, and then every day. But what do you do when you might have an opportunity to support a compromise? You compromise in risking that maybe this compromise will only give more force to the judicial overhaul? Or do you say, and that's from remark number 2, I have to be an adult. I have to be, I have to keep this state going, and maybe I have to strive for a compromise. Now, these are, and I don't have time here for that, I'll just mention, this is part of 2 strategies, larger strategies of social change, theories of social change. How do you conduct social change? Are you affirmative and work from within the system and within the existing framework? Or do you say that you have to break the existing framework and be radical and be reformative? I'm going to stop here, and we'll talk more later.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Dr. Manal Totry-Jubran.
Okay. So thank you, Masua, for the introduction. I will start by just saying that I'm a resident of Haifa. I am an indigenous resident of Haifa. I was born in Haifa, so welcome to Haifa. I think that I'm the only one in Haifa from here. And this is, yes, it is one of the most incredible towns in Israel and in the world, in my opinion, with all its complexities. It's kind of my ambivalence that we were talking about earlier that concerns the Palestinian Arab. As a Palestinian living in this mixed cities, I'm also a minority within minority, so I'm a Christian, Palestinian, Arab within, so I'm a minority in Israel and I'm a minority within the Arab society and a woman, on top of all of that. My point will be during my presentation is that, well, Herzl could have thrown up a while ago, not only yesterday. And while you were talking, I remembered a photo that I saw in Facebook earlier today about an old Arab-Palestinian man sitting on, it's not a Palestinian chair, but you know, these chairs that are low chairs with hatta nagal, with, you know, traditional clothes, and he's looking at his fellow Jews and he's saying, well, you're worried that your democracy has ended. Welcome to the club. Now you can feel what we're feeling. So this is what would be my presentation about. And I thought that, I don't know how many of you know basic information about the Palestinians in Israel. So I thought to start with some data on the issue. And then I will talk more about the judicial changes, reform, and so on. So Israel by number is almost 10 million. What is important here for you to see is that 75% of the population are Jews and about 20% are Arabs. We have, within the Arab community, we have about 400,000 that are residents but are not citizens, meaning that they don't have a passport, they only have an ID, and I'm referring to the Arabs or the Druze in the Golan Heights, the Syrian Druze from the Golan Heights, and Arabs from East Jerusalem. We have also 5% who are defined as others, who are not Jews according to the Orthodox and so on. Out of these, it's important also to know that within the Arab community, 80% of the Arab community are Muslims. We have three main religions within the Arab community, so 80%, who are 18% of the whole of Israel's population, are Muslims, 80% within the Arab community, about 10%, 11% Christians, and 9% Jews, okay? So we have also diversity within the Arab population. And Haifa is part of several cities that are defined in Israel as mixed cities. Mixed cities all around the world are not defined according to national affiliation or ethnic affiliation, but according to other characters. But when we talk about mixed cities in Israel, we talk about mixed cities where Arabs and Jews live together. So these are the main spaces that they actually reside together, let's say, not really live together. And only 1/4 or 25% of the Arabs of the Palestinian minority live in these mixed cities, okay? And now it's important to know that most of the neighborhoods within the mixed cities are separated. So we have Arab neighborhoods and Jewish neighborhoods. In Haifa, actually, there are some neighborhoods that are really mixed, Arab and Jews. In Akka as well. Have you been in Akka? Akka, yeah. We have some mixed neighborhoods, but they are, most of them are separated, and they are also separated in their education school, in the education system, in the schools. So Jews learn together and Arabs learn separately. By the way, Orthodox and secular Jews also are separated. Now we have, starting from 2008, a kind of a mixed educational system for secular, Mishalev, secular and religious. But if we move on, the rest of the Arab community, about 75%, live in completely separated cities and villages. I don't have time to explore my theory about nationally identified spaces. It's a concept that is taken from the American context, actually. But the point is that these localities, Arab and Jew, these Arab localities are totally separated from the Jewish localities. They have different schools. One of the main characters is that they are far from the center. So if you see all the green spots, here is the center, kind of. All the green spots, we have most of them in the Galil in the north and in the south. It's a bit funny to talk about center and periphery in Israel because it's so small, right? But still, when you are more in the periphery, so you are less closer to the economic center of the state. Transportation is less convenient to reach there. So they have even less social and economic mobility. Arab localities are also very crowded. This is only one picture, but most of the cities and the villages look the same. And they are very crowded. They have no available land to expand due to a policy from the establishment of the state of not allocating land. Recently, in the past 2 decades, we see more and more allocation of lands. But mainly, according to my theory, the state started to allocate more land because most of the Arab families started to go out to the Jewish villages, and this is a bit problematic. And then they started having more and more mixed cities, and that's troubling. So let's give them more land so they can expand within their spaces, okay? Okay, as I said, the Arab localities are very crowded. They have no available land to expand. And one very troubling issue that is now on the agenda of the Arab society is the killings and the murder with mishpachot pesha, crime families. That is spreading all around. It's even coming to the mixed cities just nearby. Don't get, it's not that scary, but it's spreading all over the Arab community. We are talking about more than 100 murders in the last 6-7 months, whereas last year, in this same period of time, we had 35 murderers. Okay, and why is that happening? Or before I get to that, so Masua said just 2 words about it. I just want to clarify it. My field of research is legal geography, so this is why I'm so interested in cities and segregation and so on. But the background of all this story, in order to understand what is happening today with the judicial changes and so on, is that you have to bear in mind the structure of the constitutional system of Israel, where, as Masua said, we don't have a written constitution or a formal Bill of Rights, but we do have a lot of very important judicial rulings by the Supreme Court. And starting from 1992, we have 2 basic laws that are the closest arrangements to a Bill of Rights, since they anchor some basic human rights. And then we have, in 5 years ago, a very important basic law Israel nation, the nation state of the Jewish people, where in section 1, the purpose and the declaration of this basic law is that the exercise of the right of national and self-determination in the state of Israel is unique to the Jewish people. As I mentioned before, I'm an indigenous part of this space. The basic law do not regard or do not mention at all the Palestinian community. And there are other problematic sections within the basic law. So bear in mind that we don't have a formal Bill of Rights and a constitution, but we have these 3 basic laws. We have other 10 basic laws that are also very important. Some of them are now on the table and being changed. But this is the complex judicial, judicial or the legal system in Israel. So you have to bear in mind that the starting point before all the legislation that Masua just talked about, the case of the Palestinian citizens in Israel, as I kind of indicated, and now I'll make it more clear. We already suffer from discrimination in budgets and employment. While you said about allocating employments and so on, we already suffer from that. A discrimination in the education system and allocation of land, the issue of over-policing in everyday life and in times of riot. Every time there's a riot, excluding the last riots from 2 years ago, at the year 76 and in the year 2000, every time there's a riot that involves the Palestinian citizens of Israel, we have killings where we don't have in other riots, which it was supposed to be, right? You don't go to demonstrate and you get killed. We also suffer from ethnic profiling and entering public spaces and under-policing, and this connects with the issue of the murders. There's a very under-policing, meaning that there isn't enough enforcement of the police system within the Arab localities. So even when we have all these killings, there's not enough people are charged with these killings, although most of the people within the village know who killed who, but still this thing is not being taken care of, decreasing rates of representation in public life. So when we talk about what is the position of the Palestinian minority, or how this all, the past 7 months affect the Palestinian Arab minority, so the Supreme Court really played in some cases a very important role in the case of discrimination for allocation of budget for religious services, the issue of challenging discriminatory budgeting of local authorities as well. So we have a couple of very important landmark cases in which the Supreme Court sided with the rights of the Palestinian minority, but we have also other ruling and cases in which the Supreme Court failed to provide protection for the Arab minority. I don't have time to talk about it too much, but here are some examples. So we have, on the one hand, very good rulings or worthy rulings, and other rulings that infringe on the Palestinian minorities' rights. And so when we talk about the dangers of the government's plans, I don't think that we should only concentrate with the constitutional changes that are suggested, but also you talked about it a little bit in your lecture as well. We should also study the coalition's agreements. And one of the main purposes of the coalition's agreement is maintaining the Jewish identity. So the Jewish identity instead of the Arab identity, and in some cases the Jewish ultra-Orthodox identity instead of other Jewish identities. But the group that will be most harmed from these coalition agreements and these changes would be the Palestinian minority, because their starting point is already very problematic. So I want to finish, because I saw also your questions. The Arab community now is very much occupied with the issue of the murders and the killings that are happening every day. literally every day in the Arab community. This is the Parade of the Dead, which will be happening on Saturday in Tel Aviv, for a parade that will discuss or will demonstrate the issue of the murders in Israel. And this is Iyad al-Halaq, who was murdered just a week after George Floyd. And Palestinian Lives Matter, if you can see it here. And so the troubling thing, and not only the troubling thing, you have to bear in mind that this is what is happening in the Arab community, is that the district court just 2 weeks ago gave a verdict that exonerated the officer who killed Iyad al-Halaq with no less than 7 shots. Okay, Iyad al-Halaq is 32 years old, autistic Palestinian man living in East Jerusalem. So when we talk about the judicial reforms and so on, it's kind of our democracy is different. The Palestinian minority's democracy in Israel is already different from the Jewish majority, and so the issues are different. I finish here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And our next speaker is Dr. Ruth Halperin Kedarri.
So, thank you very much for inviting me, for having me here. I guess you're pretty much depressed by now, and I'm going to depress you even more. But I promise I'll try to end with a somewhat more optimistic tone, but I'm not sure I'll succeed. So how does the judicial overhaul, and I use the term overhaul, how does it impact women? This is my own quote. I've been giving many presentations, both in Hebrew and in English, in the past 6.5 months. We talked before, and I said, since January 4th, like many others in the field, mainly in the field of law, academics, legal academics, 24/7, we haven't been doing anything else except for occasionally teaching, because we also have to teach here and there, but we haven't been doing anything else but trying to fight and be, I think, an important force in the resistance movement. And I really stand behind this, identifying this point of time as the most dangerous point of time in Israel's history for women and for our daughters. Now, a background which Masua had already talked about, and Manal also, so I'll go through it very quickly, and I guess that you've covered some of it in your course. The unique thing about Israel's democracy is that we are, to begin with, a quite deformed democracy. We don't have any systems of checks and balances that you usually find in other democracies, such as 2 houses. We only have 1 house. We don't have a constitution. We don't have, like you have, presidential veto. We don't have a federalist structure. We don't have regional elections. We are not subordinated to any supranational courts like the European Court of Human Rights. Very often, maybe you've heard, comparing what we're going through now in Israel, comparing it to Hungary or to Poland. This is a wrong comparison, because they're part of the EU, and they are also subject to the European Court of Human Rights and to the European Convention on Human Rights. We don't have any of this in Israel. So the only effective check on the government is an independent legal system. And to summarize it in a very easy to understand vision, Montesquieu's separation of powers, the ideal on the left-hand side is you have the 3 branches which are completely separate from each other. Israel today already has the executive branch totally controlling the legislative branch. And maybe you've covered it, so we don't have time to go into explaining how exactly this is happening, but take our words for it. The parliament is controlled totally by the government, and the judicial branch, at least until yesterday, was still somewhat separate. And the whole idea of the current government is to swallow the legislature also under the executive branch. How did we get here? Short history of 5 rounds of elections in 3 years. We won't go into that, but the bottom line is that in November 22, Netanyahu established the most right-wing, extremist, fundamentalist, messianic, and I can continue saying also racist and fascist government in Israel's history. And here's the picture. And in January of 23, Justice Minister Yariv Levin unveiled the governmental plan for a complete constitutional overhaul of the judicial system. What are the components of the government's plan? Again, maybe you've touched on that. The most important is the politicization of the judicial appointments, the prohibition of judicial review of whatever is titled a basic law. But as you heard from Masua, we don't have a constitution, so we don't really have the blue book on how to formulate a basic law. So you can basically say that any law, you just put the title of a basic law, and then the judiciary will be precluded from exercising any review on that law. This is part of the plan of the judicial overhaul. And then undermining judicial review of the legislation. This is actually what happened yesterday. This is the unreasonableness amendment, taking away the power of the judiciary of the High Court of Justice to exercise its review over any decision of the government or any of the governmental ministries on the grounds of it, the decision or the appointment or the policy of it being manifestably unreasonable. The High Court of Justice will no longer be able to review any such decision on the ground of unreasonableness. Okay, and this obviously affects also weakening not just the Attorney General, who will be actually subject to being dismissed now, and the fear is that the High Court of Justice will not be able to intervene in a future possible potential dismissal of the Attorney General. But this is not just weakening the Attorney General, it's weakening the whole construction of all attorneys, legal advisors of all governmental offices. And again, maybe in the Q&A we'll have the possibility to expand on that. How did we get here? We are in a point of time where 3 major interests of 3 interest groups collided together and aligned together to get us to this point. First, you've already heard about the ultra-Orthodox parties who hold a long-term grudge against the court. Ultra-Orthodox men are traditionally exempt from military service. There's a long history there. And the High Court of Justice started intervening in this a while ago, and this is part of the grudge that the ultra-Orthodox parties hold against the Supreme Court. But it's not just that. They hold the perception that the High Court of Justice had narrowed their autonomy in religious affairs and intervened in many other areas where they were precluded from pursuing many of their interests. And as Masua mentioned, the mandatory core studies, they actually want to maintain their exemption from mandatory core studies such as mathematics, English, and actually even Hebrew. Again, we'll have time in the Q&A to expand on that. Then you have the religious Zionists, fundamentalist, messianic views of Jewish supremacy, the group of parties that in fact hijacked the social group which we used to call the Zionist now I'm missing words, in the National Zionists, thank you. So this group of parties basically hijacked the social group, and they are imposing their own views of Jewish supremacy, but their end game, the end goal is to, in fact, annex the West Bank, the Palestinian occupied territories. And they've actually started doing that in the past 6 months. And both these groups, taking it to the subject of women, they hold hierarchical, patriarchal worldviews, opposing equality of any kind, and opposing also gender equality. And to this mixture, you have to add Netanyahu's own personal interest of getting out of jail free ticket, right? And you've heard about that. So where do women come in? Similar to the way that Manal presented her case of Palestinian population and Palestinian rights in Israel, women in Israel, women's position in Israel has been rather low to begin with before entering this period of judicial overhaul, because there's no civil marriage and divorce in Israel. Maybe you've discussed it. It was part of actually Masua's doctoral dissertation, looking into organizations that are trying to fight from within and change the system, but no civil marriage and divorce, only religious possibility to marry and also to divorce in Israel. And all religions in Israel have one thing in common. They are all patriarchal. They all discriminate against women. They can compete with each other, which is the worst, but they all share this. Decreasing rates of representation in public life even before the last elections, increasing gender segregation, women's exclusion, phenomena of, I can say that I'm probably more than 30 years in this fight for gender equality in Israel. And until 10 years ago, I never imagined that we would actually be talking about women's exclusion as a phenomena in Israel and in Israel's public life. And we've been experiencing this for the past 10 or more years. You get sign, okay. I'll continue with the rest. Increasing rates of domestic violence. This is related to what Manal talked about. It's a worldwide phenomena. COVID-19 increased rates of domestic violence throughout the world, and in Israel we experienced the same, and it remained very, very high. Unchanging wage gaps. What happened in the last elections? Only 29 members of the parliament out of 120, but this is more important because only 9 members are in the coalition, only 9 women in the coalition, which has the power. Only 6 ministers out of 31, and only 2 of them actually have real bureaus, real ministries. How does the weakening of the High Court of Justice affect us? Puppet judges. That's what we're going to have if and when the judicial overhaul is carried through. And historically, the High Court of Justice was really at the forefront of defending and expanding women's rights. And here you can see just 4 examples, and I will not expand on that. We can expand on that later. I know you asked about it in your questions, so just take a quick look. Very, very concise examples, but there are dozens of High Court of Justice cases and other cases that protected and expanded women's rights in Israel. How does the unreasonableness amendment, how is it going to impact rights? And here, just like the first picture which I started with in my presentation, you see the images of the Handmaid's Tale. This is probably the strongest vision of the protests in Israel, where the women's protest, which is a separate but a major part of the protest movement, women, we have been wearing the garb of the Handmaid's Tale, and people at the beginning where some people were even offended by that, and it was a common reaction to say that, oh, you're exaggerating and you don't know what you're talking about and it's never going to happen, but we see it is happening on a daily basis. how does the unreasonable amendment going to impact us? It basically says that any ministerial decisions, whether of policy or appointments, are immune from judicial review on the ground of unreasonableness. That means that the ministers can appoint whoever they want with no qualifications at all to any position of power. Take, for example, the authority for the advancement of the status of women in Israel. You can now appoint, or the Minister for Equality can now appoint a woman who is totally opposed to women's rights and to feminism and has absolutely no qualifications for the position, and the High Court of Justice will not be able to revoke this appointment. Or the National Security Minister, who is now in charge of defining the general policy of the security forces and the police forces in Israel, he can say, oh, okay, all those complaints of women complaining or alleging sexual harassment or domestic violence or sexual offenses, they will be deprioritized. They will be put at the bottom of the prioritization of investigation and indictments. And again, the High Court of Justice will not be able to intervene. Access to abortions can be vastly decreased on the discretion of the Minister of Health. All this can happen without any changes in legislation. And then you have all the changes of legislation which are upcoming, which are in the coalition agreements, and some of them have already started to take the move, such as the expansion of the jurisdiction of the rabbinical courts. And I promised, I know my time is up, so again, we can continue that in the Q&A, but I promised to end with an optimistic tone. So here you see one of the leaders of the protest movement in Israel, Professor Shikma Bressler, a physician from the Weizmann Institute. And of course, this is the symbol carrying the flag and very much reminding us of the Statue of Liberty or of Jeanne d'Arc. And we have our Iron Women. Really, the women whom at least I personally totally admire are Supreme Court President Justice Esther Chayut and Attorney General Gali Baharav Miara. Both of them, Chayut is going to end her term, reaches the age of retirement, unfortunately, very soon in October. And Gali Baharav Miara is probably facing soon to come dismissal. And the Supreme Court will probably, I don't know, probably not be able to intervene, but we'll see. We'll see. More to come.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ruth Halperin Kedarri. And our next speaker is Dr. Roy Pellet.
I have to say, first of all, that I envy all of you. Twice. First of all, because you're going back to California soon, and I'm not. And second of all, because you're enjoying this amazing program, and I'm not. And while it's normally much nicer to talk than to listen, I'd rather be on your side. Now, also, if not least, because it's very hard to give definite answers and sort of prophecies on what's going to be here. And therefore, I'm going to try and raise more question marks maybe than proclamation marks. And I want to make maybe two opening remarks and then try and put things a bit in context. You're all university students or college students, and there is something, I spent my first years of adulthood, sort of first decade, in politics, in actual parliamentary politics. And I made the move to academia because of things I didn't enjoy in campaigning. And in the last month, as Ruth described, or in the last half year, I find myself sort of campaigning again. And I'm not always really happy with it. And I think that we need to think also what we have to say as academics, which is different than the our role as campaigners right now, fighting for something. And that also means looking into some of the processes happening now and thinking what brought us here, and recognizing that some of the arguments made on behalf of the others, I'll call them right now, proponents of the government, are not totally meritless. And there are things to be said there about how we got here and about our legal system. So that's comment number one. The second is, how many of you are considering at all majoring in legal studies? Huh, okay, not a lot. You don't have to be so hesitant, it's fine. It's a sort of dignified profession, or at least used to be. Because my other thoughts are sort of, and this is actually relevant even if you're not going to major in law or legal studies, is the role of law in all of this. Is it really up to us as lawyers or jurists to sort of dictate or give the right answers? Can we and should we, can the Supreme Court and should the Supreme Court impose liberal values on a society that is clearly distancing itself from liberal values slowly but steadily, not so slowly recently? There's this notion in law that says, given the history of Nazi Germany and other places, that the role of the law is sort of sometimes to save the majority from itself. Majorities sometimes go berserk and do crazy things. And law protects core values in such times and sort of prevents catastrophes from happening. And I had the honor of hosting former President of the Supreme Court, Aaron Barak, in my constitutional law class a few weeks ago. And I said, okay, we have this notion, I asked him, right, that if there's sort of a temporary craziness of the majority, law is there to protect it and maintain values, we know that. That's sort of easy. What happens if over an extended period of time, of decades, the majority actually doesn't go crazy, but knowingly chooses illiberal values? What can the law do then? Is it the role of the law to sort of stop the majority from, can it, should it? And Barak said, I hope that if that's the case, I won't be around to see it. That's sort of an easy answer, but I'm not sure it's an answer for people your age, at least. Barak is 87. He can give that answer. So with those two thoughts in mind, I want to go into two issues seemingly loosely connected, which I told Rami I'll talk about, and try and connect them. And one is really what's going to happen with judicial appointments in this judicial overhaul. And the other is what's going to happen to the civil service. And the reason I think they're connected demands that I introduce a concept which I don't really know if has a good translation into English. Maybe my colleagues here can help me. It's called in Hebrew the word mamlachtiyut, which is statism, which is sort of translates into statism, but I'll try to explain what it is and why this current judicial overhaul is sort of kicking that away. Israel made a choice, the leaders of Israel, the founders of Israel, made a choice when it was founded, very different than the choice made when the US law was formed. And the choice was to go the track of statism, meaning that our organs of government should represent a wide notion of state, the public at large, not the political powers. That power emanates not from the head of the pyramid, from the president in US terms, but from public at large. That has very real meanings. Israel was founded in a context of one very strong political party, with one very strong leader, David Ben-Gurion. But it spoke the language, even if it didn't always walk the walk. It talked the talk of institutions that are wide, representative, take into account all sectors of society, interests of all parties. One clear expression of that is that civil service, allegedly, this was not in practice the case, definitely in Israel's first 1 or 2 decades. But the ethos was, and ethoses have significance, even if they're not carried out as such. The ethos was that civil service doesn't serve the government. It serves the public. While normally a US administration official is supposed to ask himself, what does the president expect from me, right? What's his policy? What am I supposed to carry out and implement? In Israeli civil service, very much following a British model, he's not supposed to ask himself that, actually. He's supposed to ask himself or herself, what does the public expect from me? What is the public interest? And that's one notion of statism, right? I don't support a political faction or a party. I don't, serve. I serve the public at large. And that also plays into judicial appointments. And when the state was founded, it created a very balanced and very unique at the time form of judicial appointments, which said justices will be appointed by a committee which represents the government, the parliament, the bar, right, the legal profession, and the justices themselves, in a way that none of these groups can control the process. Again, very different, by the way, from the way that it is in the US, where the president appoints. Indeed, there's approval in the Senate, and sometimes the Senate does not go with the president. A good deal of the time it does. Here there was a very, very well-balanced system. As I said, unique at the time, although in recent years, many other countries adopted different versions of this kind of judicial appointment committee. What we saw as the first step, or second maybe, one of the first two major steps in this judicial overhaul was an attempt to change that and give the government the power to appoint whatever justices it likes. Luckily for us, this created a huge row, and this was the focus of protests at first, and the government sort of took a step back at the beginning, and then a full step back and sort of dropped this for now. It is definitely very much on the table, and can any day now come back. And I don't think we need to expand on the meanings of that, right? I'll just say, just to show in a way how ingenuine the government was about this, the argument articulated to the public was, in most of the world, elected officials, parliamentarians, get to influence the appointment of judges, which is true, but almost nowhere is it the government and the majority in parliament that gets to appoint justices, and that's what they wanted to do here. It's still on the table. And I want to move my sort of shift my focus to civil service and then bring them together. As was mentioned earlier, right, when the government passed this, the parliament approved of this government bill yesterday to prevent the court from striking down ministerial decisions that are unreasonable, based on their unreasonableness. What they basically wanted is to be able to be more free in appointments. Now, if we look, Ruth earlier mentioned that you can appoint, right, a chauvinist to head the Authority for Women Equality now. In the US, these things actually happen, right? We've seen an anti-environmentalist appointed to head the EPA, right, the Environmental Protection Agency. In the current US system, you can do that, and you don't have that sort of tool for the court to come in and strike that down. And we've seen crazy things happen. In Israel, we did have that tool as of yesterday afternoon, up to yesterday afternoon. The government removed it not because of some judicial, jurisprudential theory on the balance between government and the courts, but because of a very clear plan to overtake civil service and make it a servant of the government, and a servant of the government, as Ruth already also presented, to reach very specific goals, right? Those of the ultra-Orthodox and of the national religious, of the new form of national religious. I have to say, it's not the national religious parties we knew 20 years ago. So a national religious, right? Basically, the settlement, West-backed settlements. So unlike the US, where there is, on the one hand, the power to do this for the president, but there is also, a much bigger, much more complex system with much more protections on the road of what these civil servants do. Here you can achieve dramatic changes rather quickly. And if the government has its way in really reappointing now many people in the civil service, we're going to be in deep trouble. I think much before we're going to become a semi-dictatorship, we're going to become a banana republic. In the sense that what happens when you appoint people that are just not qualified for, forget about women's rights for 30 seconds or minority rights for 30 more. Just think about infrastructure, about roads, about housing, about buildings. When you begin to appoint party operatives that are just not qualified to do the job, what you get is a third world country with just lousy infrastructures and lousy planning and things like that. And of course, not incidentally, these things come hand in hand with dictatorship. But I have 1 minute? 2 minutes. Oof, I'll go crazy. Why? I'm gonna try and also end optimistically.
You don't have
to. What we have seen in recent months, in a way, by the way, I think I'll make another comparison with the US. I said that the president, of course, has enormous powers in the US, which the prime minister here doesn't have. We did see at the latter parts of the Trump administration, people sort of stepping out of the traditional role of a US administration official and actually standing up to the president, right? We saw that in the Attorney General's office very clearly after the elections, where he tried to get them to investigate all kinds of wrongdoings. We see signs of that here, and that only can happen and only does happen and only will continue to happen if the social protests are as strong as they recently are. The protests in the streets are what gives civil servants the backing and the feeling that they can stand up to their political bosses. Just to give an example, which is sort of a bit of a double-edged sword, but I'll explain why. Very early on, the minister in charge of the police, which was mentioned earlier, demanded from the police chief to fire the police chief for the Tel Aviv district because he thought he was too soft on the protesters. And the police chief went along with the minister and fired him, and 24 hours later, he had to back up and say, no, I made a mistake, I'll reappoint him, because of how strong the response from the protesters was. Fast forward a few months, and that police chief of Tel Aviv district is retiring. So this is always a complicated, or forced to retire. It's always a complicated, picture, and we have to sort of zoom in to understand things. But I think the protests are giving lots of power to civil servants to do the right thing in this situation. That brings me to my final sentence. I don't know, and this may come up in the discussion, that we are not expecting too much from the Supreme Court and the legal system, and that we are not actually assuming too much, my colleagues and I, regarding our power as jurists. I'll say just this to maybe stir up some debate. As you know, there was an appeal with the Supreme Court filed yesterday afternoon to strike down the legislation that was passed. I'll say here, were I a Supreme Court justice, I seriously doubt that I would strike down that legislation. I don't think the Supreme Court can save us from these things. I think it is up to us as civil activists to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So the next part is more of a discussion. I will be posting, let's say I have a long list of questions, but I will choose only one of them to give the panelists opportunity to answer that, just one question. And then we will open it to students in the audience to ask more questions that they have prepared for us. So I'm going to choose the following question. It appears like the majority of legal scholars in Israel, including it appears this panel of 4 legal scholars, are against the judicial overhaul. Even more, in the recent Bar Association elections, Amit Bachar, the chairperson, who declared that he is opposing the reform, won with more than 70% of the vote. But yet we know that there are some legal scholars who have for years criticized the Supreme Court, criticized the Israeli judicial system, the appointments, and some of them even were public in their support for the judicial reform. I was wondering if any of the panelists could take this responsibility of trying to explain to us why some of those legal experts are in fact in favor for a change, and more specifically in favor of some of these changes in legislation.
So I'm going to run counter to what I just said. I think it's complicated. I think there are good reasons to oppose the system we had so far. That said, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'd say we are in a situation where looking at public law professors, okay, let's put aside tort law and people that actually deal with this stuff, I think somewhere between 5, maybe a little more than 5% actually support what's going on, and maybe 5 to 10% are sort of middle of the way, and 85 to 90% oppose it. And that's because there is actually a right answer to this. In the framework of a liberal democracy, if we're not stepping out of that, this judicial overhaul is wrong. And I think those, I don't want to psychoanalyze those 5% who support it. I don't, so I won't. But I think our Supreme Court did crazy things along the last 30 years. I think our constitutional structure is very problematic. I think we said here, right, that we don't have any procedure and sort of any sound way to reach constitutional legislation and amendments. And I have to say, I think we as the liberal secular group in society abused that to some extent in the last 30 years. And the Supreme Court passed rulings that were not legally sound in some cases and showed disrespect to the will of the majority, which not always deserves respect, right? If we think of minority issues like Manal talked about earlier, there is lots of jurisprudence why that deserves different treatment than many other issues. So I'll just say, in short, I think there is real merit in the accusation that our Supreme Court on some issues was not differential enough to parliament and government. Antonin Scalia, the late US Supreme Court Justice, which I don't follow his philosophy, but I think it's interesting to remember, once said that when he wants to think the US Supreme Court is not as bad as he sometimes says, he goes and reads decisions of the Israeli Supreme Court because those guys there are really crazy, he said. I don't think that's an overall, that's Scalia, and I don't think that's an overall fair description of the Supreme Court, but I don't think it's soundless, it's groundless. And that does not mean that you need to support this judicial overhaul. It's not about fixing things that were wrong. It's about taking over the system to make it a servant of certain political aspirations. And that's why there's no real dispute among the public law community in Israel about this.
Can I add just two sentences? I think that just following and what you just said, I'm not sure that judicial overall is the right title for it. It's more a system overall. Regime, yeah, yes, Mishtar. Regime overhaul. And so it's not whether you are it's not only a legal issue, but it is a civil and public issue. So it's not it's not an issue that's supposed to be only analyzed by a legal scholar, but also by political scientists and so on. And another thing that just complements what you just said, by opposing a regime overall or judicial overall, that does not mean that we are not critical of the current system. And I think that we all talked about the problems that the Israeli legal system has, but what is happening now is not a solution of how to deal with these problems, but just to diminish the system at all. So it's important for me to emphasize also that it's not that I'm supporting the current legal system. I think that the legal system and the judicial system has many problems. There's only one, for example, only one Arab, also he's a man. The three men that were in the Supreme Court, that resided in the Supreme Court, were only men, and only three Arab judges, and we only had every time only one Arab judges. So the fight was on the Arabic chair, and not who is more qualified, even if we have two Arabs that can reside. So I have a lot of criticism, and also about the rulings, but that does not mean that let's ruin everything, but let's rethink how we should provide the right answer to this problem.
Yeah, I'll just add that we make our living criticizing the Supreme Court decisions, at least we used to, and I completely agree with Roy and with Manal. And what's happening now is as if you have a patient who suffers from cold, and instead of giving her Tylenol, you put her morphium. Yes, you give an overdose of morphium. That's actually what's happening now.
Can I say, nevertheless, all of this, and I agree completely with each and every statement here. Maybe to say a bit differently what you said. Israeli liberals burned the Supreme Court. Burned completely. The fact that they went to the court every time when they are not a majority for the past over 30 years. They're not the majority. They are not succeeding politically. So they took their case and legalized everything. Some of the things need to be in the legal sphere. A lot of political issues were legalized because Israeli liberals, which I am a part of, thought they could get what they thought was necessary and crucial through the court, and they would lose in the parliament. So the public trust and the erosion of the public trust in the Supreme Court is a process of the liberals burning it. That's one. And number two, there is a deep perception, misguided perhaps, but a deep perception that the Supreme Court made a choice. Everyone has a choice between the Democratic and the Jewish. It made a choice to prefer the Democratic and to set aside the Jewish. If Avi Maoz from the slideshow said, let's drop the Democratic, the perception is the Supreme Court and the Israeli liberals decided to drop the Jewish. This is not something that happens just in Israel, but over the world, we see the backlash against liberalism exactly because liberalism is perceived, again, partly misguidedly, but not only, but perceived as if it's rejecting localized and particular culture. Because of that, in the end, the majority of the population in Israel is very much particular. By the way, be it Jewish or Arab-Palestinian, then choosing a liberalism that is completely void of any particular cultural values, that means that I don't feel the need to fight for this court. I don't feel the need to fight for this institution, even though I might know that it's an important institution, but I have no need to fight for it when there are politicians who are right now, because of the reasons that were said before, who are right now abusing the need in a reform for their nefarious interests.
Okay, thank you. I will stop. I'm not going to ask more questions, maybe later on if we have time. I'm going to hand it now to the students. We will take a few questions, you can take notes, and then we will try to answer a bunch of questions all together. For the recording, we need to use this microphone. So if you can just hold it like this.
My question is about the contrast and the balance of democracy and liberal values, and what to do when non-liberal values are imposed by a democracy or a majority. So we saw that many times in many different countries, including Germany, Venezuela, Brazil. So what does the liberal minority do when it sees the majority becoming less and less democratic, or less and less, even more democratic, actually, but less liberal? Because whether we want it or not, the majority of Israel is getting more and more less, like it's getting less and less liberal. So even if you stop it right now, I believe that in 20 or 30 years, they're going to be the supreme majority and they're not going to be liberal at all. So would the liberals in Israel be willing to give up democracy to retain their values? And would that make sense with the liberal ideology? Or would they just watch and see as non-liberal leaders are elected by a majority that is according to the liberal ideology? So what do you do in this situation?
More questions?
I think mine is very, very similar to that. I'm wondering, the way that I see it is that what's going on now is there's protests and there's backlash, and there was an attempt by the public to stop this. I recognize that now the party who's in power and it has the coalition is a party that dictates the courts and everything. To me, that suggests that voting is now even more important in Israel. I'm wondering what the role of voting is going to become as time progresses.
Okay. You can also ask a specific question to a specific guest speaker. You can say their name and then state the question if you'd like.
Hi. My question isn't like specific, but I was wondering like what you think the reaction of the rest of the world is going to be like politically and also like in terms of funding towards Israel, etc., as a result of the judicial reforms, and if like any pressure from like external countries is going to affect like how it progresses.
Okay, let's stop here and maybe allow our panel to try and answer. Question about what should the liberals do? What is the value of voting moving forward? And how might this affect the relations of Israel with other countries and regarding funding of Israel?
Well, before addressing the questions, I will let you answer, but I think that there is a really factual issue that needs to be presented. We're not talking about majority minority here, because if we study the elections results, we have 64. We have 64 seats as opposed to 56. But if we count the popular vote, we have more actually on the center. Left wing and rather than the right wing. The thing is that our parliamentary system, and because of some political issues of some parties that did not collide together, it did not run together, so they lost some of the votes. So we're not really talking about majority minority here. It's much more complicated at present. It's much more complicated. But the fiction is that the coalition is all the time talking about we have the majority voice and we have the mandate from the public. This is not true. If we study the facts, if we study the the voting, this is not a true fact. And I will let you answer my...
I want to sort of half disagree, because we have to remember that in what we currently call opposition, we do have some seriously right-wing, Jewish supremacist parties. So if you look at...
But not illiberal. It's more complicated.
Compared to what we have now in the government.
I mean, maybe Saar not, but Lieberman... I don't know. No, I do want to agree that it's not a clear-cut majority-minority thing, definitely. I mean, we're alive and kicking, and we're roughly, very much like the States, right? It's sort of also 50-50, and sometimes you get minority president elected, right, with less votes than the majority.
And not illiberal and right, because we have liberal rights and illiberal lefts.
So on that front, before we continue, because I am the only political scientist on the panel, and would say that even looking at this from this perspective of them not having the majority, I think this is a little bit not the right way to look at it, because we count in the votes all of the Arab-Palestinian voters, but the fact is that 75 years of Israel's history, their representatives in the Knesset have not been actually counted as really part of the game. The only short instance of them being counted, and them by saying part of them, only the United Arab List, was counted as part of the coalition, part of the government, only for the last government before this one, by Netanyahu for only 1 year and a half. This is the exception versus during Rabin time, they were not part of the coalition, but their votes were transformative. They helped the Rabin government, they helped the Oslo.
And they had bargaining power.
To some extent. But this is the first time actually that they are being invited really to be part of the coalition. It happened just 2 years ago. It lasted only for 1 year and a half. We can do this thing, Manal, that you're suggesting, if and when the secular Jewish population that Masua talked about it earlier, if they acknowledge that these are part of Israeli society, these are part of the core of Israeli society, we must count them in the protest, which is not, we know. We must count them in the change that should happen in Israel for a more liberal Israel. And if they are not acknowledging that, and I sense that they are not, we are still going to see, this is my sense, the same process that is happening now with this judicial reform moving forward even more if they are sidelined, not counted, and we cannot say that we are actually having the majority, if we want to say, to talk about we. And I will stop here, sorry.
No, we don't, because I ask you, but also once we count them, we have to recognize not all of them are liberals.
Sure.
So if you go to rabbinical courts, they might also have their, aspirations.
And we have to think ahead. We have to think about the demography. And we used to use this term demography when talking about the Arab-Israeli conflict, but now we're actually using this term thinking about the internal Jewish population and the increasing birth rate among the non-liberal, religious, ultra-Orthodox segments of the Jewish population versus the liberal seculars who, we have to admit, some of them, us, are actually leaving Israel. I think all of us know personally a number of families that have already or are in the process of relocating. And there is a substantial forecast that in terms of demography, the illiberal forces within the Jewish population, putting aside Arab population, will become a real majority and not just this temporary political total failure of the centrist left parties that have brought us to this to where we are now. And so your questions are extremely valid, and it's not that I have foolproof answer to that. I think this is something that states and liberal forces throughout the global north are now facing with backsliding democracies and coming together interest groups of conservative, religious, sometimes it's church, clerical forces. In our situation, it's the rabbinical forces. In Muslim countries, it's the more fundamentalist Islamist forces. So we're facing this throughout the world. I am a strong believer in human rights, and I would like to see international human rights norms and laws and entities become stronger, and just very, very shortly, for us, I think that we are at the very last moment in our protest movement, hoping to turn around the recent, what we are now going through. It's the very last moment of our ability to formulate an entrenched constitution that will entrench universal human rights. If we lose this at this point of time, I think that the future looks rather bleak.
The reason why we're asking these questions is the reason of demography. Because we know that the ultra-Orthodox population in Israel is the fastest growing population in the world right now, not just in Israel. And we know that demography-wise, the religious fundamentalist Jewish forces are increasing in Israel, whereas secular liberals are decreasing. But I want to argue that that it's not, as Roy said, we're alive and kicking. It's not necessarily that being more religious is automatically illiberal. We are at the last opportunity, it's true. I don't know when the next election will be, but right now, at least right now, according to the map, liberals will win the next elections. And if that happens, there is a window to shift the way Judaism, Israeli Judaism is. Now we have a great model in North American Judaism, what Judaism can be and how liberal Judaism, what the potential of liberal Judaism is. If to continue what I said before about the perception of Judaism and the importance of and the rejection of liberalism of particular identities, if we can redesign or reclaim Judaism as it should be, as a liberal Judaism, then we stand a chance. That's one. That was very optimistic, and I'm not optimistic these days. So what do you do if that's not going to be the case? And if Israeli Judaism continues on being more fundamentalist, ultranationalist, Jewish supremacist, and I'm part of this community right now. You don't see it, but I'm Orthodox, I'm religious Zionist. That's my home. A few months ago, I was in a panel in Palo Alto for Israelis. They were so mad at me. Because we were talking about what's next, what's going to happen next. And the question that I tried to raise before is, what should Israeli liberals do? One strategy is to say, I'm done. The ultra-Orthodox, it worked great for them to be a minority because they were able to safeguard all of their autonomies. They're not enlisting to the army. They have their own educational system. That's what we need. We need our own educational system. We need to be, we need our equality in our own spaces. We need our own culture. We need our own museums. And we're just going to be a minority. And, you go and control the country as fundamentalists that are not enlisting to the army. Good luck. That's one option. Second option is to say, it's not fair. It's not fair. We're taking the majority of the burden in this country, in tax payments, in enlisting to the military, in leading in being the elite of Israeli society. It's not fair. But you know what? We might not have a choice, and we have to keep on leading. It might cause conflicts democracy-wise, because at some point it's going to create a clash between the majority and the controlling minority. And we're not sure we want to be Lebanon, where a minority controls a majority. And it doesn't matter if the minority is a democratic minority or a liberal minority. The majority is an illiberal minority, an illiberal majority. But it's a question of strategy. And the problem When I was in the panel in Palo Alto, I said that we need to be the adults, and we need not to go back to, not to step back and become our own in our own groups. And they were mad at me because it's not fair, and they're right because it's not fair. And the secular Jews, liberal Jews in Israel have had enough, and they're right. But I don't know if it's a solution. I don't know what the end game of this is. The problem is that it's so difficult, harking back to social change and the theme of this whole fellowship. It's so difficult in real time to choose what's the best strategy for us right now. So hard. There are so many possibilities, and each road we'll take, there would always be the road not taken, and history, to lishpot otanu, to judge us.
Okay, let's take another round of questions.
I
from
think
the
what he
students.
wanted, but
Oh, you wanted to say 4? Sorry.
Take another round.
Okay.
I'll find a way to put in what I want
There was
to
a
say.
question
Anyhow,
about international
yeah.
influence also.
it was so convenient for us not to say anything about that.
No, actually,
take another round, and
Yeah,
I promise
let's see.
I promise to
More
answer
question?
that too later.
I have a question. Can you guys kind of explain the different routes that are possible with, like, if the law gets overturned or if it goes through, like, what are the options that the Israeli public has to, like, fight it besides protests? Are there any other options now that they've passed this law?
So this is a question specifically for Dr. Totry-Jubran, but like seeing that Palestinian citizens aren't like protesting in large numbers at all, like as we saw like in 2020 when there was like, bombings in Gaza. What do you think, and like, they're going to be most affected by these laws. Why do you think they feel this way? And do they just feel like basically what's happening is the rest of the society is going to be just as undemocratic as they feel like it is now? So it's not really their battle to fight.
Hello. So my question is, well, I wrote it before the judicial overhaul was passed, but now it's passed. So I wanted to know what you all see as like an uprising of like opposing communities coming together to push back against this judicial overhaul, and if you think that this is like with so much tension in Israel between communities, if you think the passing of this overhaul is kind of a like leverage or a way to bring different communities who have historically had tension, bringing them together to fight back against something that will affect all of them.
You can go this way. So much there. Have half an hour? I want to say a few things and I'll roll back from that. Israel has serious tensions between different groups, like many countries. I actually think Israeli Jews, 80% of them agree on 80% of the things. It is not as, there are not as many frictions as shown. And the interesting thing in the protests now is that you do not see counter-protests in serious numbers. You see well-organized groups from the settlements, etc., but what you see is now roughly 60% of the population opposing this reform and very strongly mobilized in the streets. And you see 40% or 30-something sort of supporting it, but not wholeheartedly, and people are not out there. So I actually think, and you see it, by the way, these 60% are, yes, largely the center-left, but also a few groups from the religious areas, so I think I'm more optimistic in that sense. I think I'm also, for the next round, as Masua said, more optimistic on voting, also because people are very mobilized right now. So I think turnout might work in our advantage, but I think we're screwed in the long run in that sense, like was mentioned here. But on 2 points, maybe I'm going to pick up a fight with you, Ruth, on the international point and on something I'll say why. Honestly, I don't think the international scene matters a lot. For 30, 40, 50 years, we've been telling Israelis, we the liberal left, that we can't go on occupying the West Bank because it's against international law, because settlements are illegal, because the UN will come after us. And nobody ever came after us. And we have a carte blanche from the international community to do roughly whatever we want with the Palestinians. And the world is, Europe is going to the right now as well. We're not going to have more trouble from them. We're going to have less. And heaven forbid if Trump is elected in 2024. So that's just not in my calculus. Maybe Biden can do some stuff. I don't think he has the stomach for it, for American internal reasons. I just never played that card in Israel, never said we can't do this because of the international community. And I think it's just not sincere. I don't think we're going to go under any pressure. But B, I think it's counter. I don't think it's a useful argument. I think it just makes people sort of more, Israelis anyhow are in this, the whole world is against the psyche, and it just makes people, and that taps into what Masua said earlier and to the question about liberal democracies. And I just subscribe to everything she said. We just need to find a way to make liberal values more compatible with people's sense of belonging to their local community. And we failed in that in the last century, roughly. And where I wanted to maybe pick up a fight with you and give a concrete example, there is a big debate in Israel going on in academia in the past 4 or 5 years of engaging ultra-Orthodox communities in academic education, which created, or people who tried to promote this, created special campuses for ultra-Orthodox men and women to obtain academic degrees, where men and women study in separate classes and where men only have male lecturers. And there is a huge debate. This is very problematic, A, because of the segregation between men and women, and B, because women are not allowed to be professors in classes of men. But the upside of that, as far as I was concerned, and I taught in such a campus, and I was also a bit active in the legal fight around this and from the wrong side, I think we have huge interest in engaging with the ultra-Orthodox community and exposing them to liberal values, to academia, and I think we underestimate the chances of making them more open to liberal ideals, and we just must find a way to engage with them, and I think we're not taking that seriously enough.
Okay, so I cannot just not pick it up. And I'll really try to be very, very short, but we do have major differences here. I'll start with the gender segregation in academia. I think it proves that it doesn't work. They do not adopt the liberal values. And we have examples of places where, when the state did not just throw the red rug for their demands for gender segregation, like in the U.S. or in other countries, ultra-Orthodox, surprise, surprise, do go to mixed gender education, and they get educated. And from my perspective, this is the slippery slope, and this is and what we are witnessing now is the concretization of the warnings against this slippery slope. But I won't expand on that. But I also differ with you with respect to international influence. It's true that the whole world is undergoing a shift to the right and experiencing the backlash and backsliding of democracies and uprising of populist regimes. But I do believe that we are still at a point where what worked in South Africa must and can and should work here as well. And Israel is becoming more and more an apartheid state. And I do expect the international community to intervene. And it's not just Biden or European countries, it's also the International Criminal Court. And there is an investigation going on at the ICC. I think it can proceed. And I think that a combination of these forces, together with forces of the what we call Jewish diaspora, Jewish communities out of Israel, mostly in Northern America, like Masua referred to, the liberal Jewish society in North America, such movements as J Street, which has some influence, and I do expect them to become more forceful. And I do expect the U.S. to use its force with respect to foreign aid. Israel is the #1 country in the world. I don't remember the figure now in my head, but it's astronomical.
3 out of 13 billion total, I think, something like that.
Or more than that. I mean,
20-something%
we
of the
would
whole
not
international
survive
aid.
for 1 month without the foreign aid from the U.S. And it should be made use of that. And I just want to quote another section of international influence is the economy and the market. So Morgan Stanley cuts Israel's sovereign credit to, quote, dislike stance after judiciary changes, and there is a similar announcement from Moody's credit, what you call it, דירוג אשראי, credit ranking. This could have, it's not going to be the game changer, but more and more reactions like this could make a difference. I hope they will.
Okay. I was thinking how to answer your question. So I'll tell a personal story. A couple of days ago, my sister told me, we were talking, I gave a speech during these demonstration, and this was the only time that I went to a demonstration. And it's about standing in front of 6,000-7,000 people with flags, with Israeli flags, singing the anthem at the end of the demonstrations, coming on the bama, on the stage after militarily officers with militarily speeches. And I remember my sister telling me that she was so scared, she was so frightened to be in this space because first of all, the Israeli flag does not represent me. I do not feel part of the Israeli flag. Nefesh Yehudi, which is the words of the anthem, it doesn't include me. It doesn't. Jewish soul. So all these kind of technical issues leaves us away from the demonstrations. And this is one thing, and I will add. Well, Ruth said that she has been given lectures in Hebrew and in English. I've been also giving in Arabic, so I can at least present to the Arab community what is happening. And so one of demonstrations is only one road of opposing the overall judicial issue, but there are also other means to do that, and I don't go and I'll tell people go and demonstrate. I think that my duty is at least to present them all the implications of what is happening. When I was on my way, it's a city near Tel Aviv, on my way, and I was like, oh my God, why am I doing this? Why should I stand in front of these people and talk and give a speech? But I think that there are more and more Arab-Palestinians participating in speeches, less in demonstrations, but in speeches, because it's very important to voice a voice. And I think that you said it before. What is special about these demonstrations is that we do hear more voices that we didn't hear before. Most of other demonstrations that the Israeli society have encountered before were specific demonstrations on specific issues about the ultra-Orthodox against the Supreme Court, against the disengagement, about the Arab-Palestinians against some issues. But this demonstration is a more inclusive. It has a lot of exclusive aspects as well. But we have to acknowledge that there are some also inclusive aspects within it, and this is something that we as the Palestinian minority, we should work with it and go and voice our voice. Although it is really, it was a interesting experience because my soul left my body and just my body was there and talking. And then, it's really a very challenging issue. Now, and you talked about Gaza. So during these 7 months, we had the verdict of Iyad al-Halaq. We had a killing, a shooting through Ramadan in Al-Aqsa. We had the engagement in Sabtanur, Good Saturday. What do you call it in English? I have no idea. During Easter. We had the attack on Gaza. We had 15 and 60. We had Tamimi, that a few months child who was killed. So it's really difficult to engage in this story or this narrative of the Jewish liberal democracy under all of these events. And I remember on one Saturday, I'm not a religious person at all, but still culturally I have a lot of issues. So how do you expect me to go and demonstrate when a week ago, I forgot his name, he was killed just a week when they wanted to enter the church before Easter. There was these violent engagement. So it's still, despite whatever I just said about the importance and everything, it is still a very Jewish-marked battle. And this is very unfortunate because I feel bad, or I feel that I do want to go and demonstrate. And there's also another issue is that I'm totally afraid of going to demonstrate because the history shows arrests against Palestinian Arabs. So I don't. It's not my issue to go and demonstrate because I don't let my kids go and demonstrate because I am frightened that they would get arrested. Still, I totally believe in this fight, and I want to be part of this fight in spite of all this. So I find my ways to fight it. And I have to say that, like my family, my husband is totally against everything that I do. He says he's really happy that now the international community would see Israel and in its real face, and the overall will proceed.
So the welcome to the club was your husband's words.
Yeah. So it's really complicated, and I'm really. We talked about it earlier. I'm really ambivalent, and what I like during these 7 months. I personally have gone under a lot of changes, starting from saying no to speeches, and now I think that they are important. And then the verdict of Iyad al-Halaq it was a really backlash to me. So it's really complicated. I hope that I kind of touched upon the complexity of the issue.
I want to continue in one point here. The main incredible success of the protest movement is also its tragedy. And that's the reclaiming of Zionism and the flag of Israel. So the reclaiming of Zionism and the flag of Israel in every protest and the anthem turned the protest into a mass movement and a mass phenomenon, really crossing audiences and populations in the Jewish society in Israel. And that's the main tragedy. And this takes me back to the mamlachtiyut that Roy spoke about before, the statism. The statism in Israel was meant to be really cross nationality and cross-ethnic, but statism in Israel, unfortunately, became like a synonym of Jewishness. So statism is not true statism, but statism is statism for the Jewish population in Israel. That's one. And the second thing I want to end with is saying that we are all legal scholars and we've talked about legislation and law and legal institutions, but this is not really about the law or about legal institutions. What we're seeing in the streets right now and what we're seeing in Israel right now is tensions and crises that has been with us for decades, but they're now all out in the open, blowing up together, not one at a time, but together. And people are not protesting for 28 weeks about 29. I'm sorry, I need to refresh it every week. For 29 weeks because of the Committee for the Appointment of Justices. People are not protesting for 29 weeks because of the reasonableness doctrine. They're protesting because of the identity of the State of Israel, the future of the State of Israel, and more importantly, the future of Israeli society.
Thank you so much. That was an incredible contribution, including this past round of things that each one of you have said. So I would like to thank our guest speakers for their wonderful contribution for this panel. I would like to also thank my audience, my own students, for their active participation and for the questions that you have asked. I would like to also thank our partners in this study abroad global internship program in Haifa, the Helen Diller Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies, the UC Berkeley Study Abroad Program, and Yahel Israel. And finally, I would like to personally thank Stil Miron, Rivka Avera, and Dana Talmai, who have joined us today from the Yahel team, but also for their extraordinary work to help us put this panel together and generally to help us run this program. Thank you so much. Hope to see you again in future.
Thank you.
תודה.